Okay, so I'm here with Wendy Manning, and she is is a distinguished professor here in Bowling Green, and we're going to be talking about stuff about family and sociology. So we'll just start out with just a brief introduction, if you want. Your background, your education background, how you landed at BG, stuff like that.
Okay, so I'm Wendy Manning. I earned my PhD from the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and from there I did a postdoc at Penn State, and then I came to Bowling Green in 1995, so I've been here ever since. And my background, I call myself a family demographer, and so the family is a core socializing unit, also a core unit that cares for young children and our elderly in the United States. So it's a very important institution to study when you're interested in learning more about the well-being of children, youth, and adults.
Okay. So did you pick BG for any specific reason, or?
They had a burgeoning group of population scholars here and people studying population science, and so I was interested in coming here. And then once I got here, I enjoyed my colleagues so much that, and we've built this great program, and we have National Institutes of Health funded population center here, and I have great colleagues doing fascinating work all on the American family, so in different elements of the family. So it's a really exciting place to be and to work with students.
Okay. How would you define family in like the traditional sense in America right now?
So we actually used to have a journal called Journal of the it was Journal of Marriage and the Family. And it sort of implied that there was just one family and one kind of family in the United States. And of course, that's one of the things that we're all very interested in, is the evolving changes in family life. And we think about this sort of maybe iconic 1950s family where you have two parents, two children, and nobody else is living in the household. No one else comes in or leaves the household. And once those children turn 18, they happily move on and form their own families. And that really doesn't happen anymore in the United States. I mean, it does for some people, and especially for those with college educations, that's an option. But for many people in the United States, that's not how families start, and that's not how they are sustained. And so something that I think college students and parents of college students are very interested in is this return of children to the home, boomeranging, they call that, back to the home after they graduate from college, or never leaving the parental home. And so that's something that's changed a lot, that's sort of interest of young adults. And other big changes have been, we've had a delay in the age at first marriage, so that we're at a historic high point. So for men, the median age point at which half of men get married is 29, and it just seems to increase or stay stable every year. And for women, it's about age 27. And so we have these really high ages at marriage, meaning that in these young adult years, you have a lot of time to do other things. So it might be returning home, you might be living with roommates, a lot of people are cohabiting. So that's also at a high point that we've, more young adults have actually lived with somebody than have ever gotten married. So those are some of the changes that are occurring. More children are born outside of marriage. We have about 2/5 of children are born to unmarried parents. Some of those parents are cohabiting, and some are actually living alone. And so most of the growth we've seen in that has been due to growth in cohabitation.
Okay. This might be too broad to really legitimately get into, but
Okay.
The kind of changing landscape of the family, do you think that's kind of think that originates from like kind of an economic like feasibility kind of thing, or is it like a social, drift, so to say?
Right. I think it's probably a combination, so I have a cop-out answer. So some of it is to do with economics. So people feel like they can't get married until they feel economically stable. And so given some of the changes in the types of jobs that are available to folks and how stable they are, and how they have shifting work hours and shifting in sort of our gig economy isn't as conducive to marriage because you don't feel financially set. We know that housing costs have increased. Young adults have growing levels of loans, not just student loans, so that makes them, they are not quite financially set in order to get married. So some of it is economics, but some of it is changing social norms and acceptance of all kinds of family types. So there used to be a lot of stigma associated with maybe having a child out of what they used to call out of wedlock, and people would have a shotgun marriage. You try to get married before the child was born, so the child would be born in marriage, but those levels have really declined. We don't feel as, we don't have as many negative views about cohabitation as we used to, so some people's grandparents are cohabiting, they're cohabiting. It's not viewed in such a negative light, I think, as it used to be. So some of our attitudes about family life have changed, and some people ask me about changing religious norms and views, and as a nation we're less religious than we used to be, but even amongst people who are religious, a lot of religions and a lot of different groups are opening their doors to wider groups of people and not being as maybe judgmental or dismissive of members of their groups who are not living what might be considered what used to be the typical American family, which really no longer is, and people have written entire books about how it really never existed. So I think it's a combination of economics, social norms, some of it is just preferences. There's a lot of concern about young adults are concerned about getting married because they're afraid they might get divorced. And so there might be some pressure to do it right. And you've seen that generation has seen their parents get divorced and are just more realistic maybe about what you can expect. People are expecting more out of their marriages than they used to.
Less stigma on getting divorced.
Getting divorced, right? Definitely, yeah. And so they see you can survive it, but still there's sort of this fear of divorce where it's viewed as a failure, and it's like if you want to be cautious or savvy and make the right decision so you can avoid having that happen. And I think that's led to some of the delays in marriage, or these concerns about divorce. If I never get married, then I'm never going to get divorced, right? So it's, why rush into marriage? And so there's that notion as well. So there's sort of some cultural, as I said, the social, you have less parental pressure and peer pressure. And so I think there's a combination of factors working together to sort of create this current climate.
Okay. Do you want to move into the Supreme Court stuff now?
Sure, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what was that like?
I was asked by the American Sociological Association to lead the research on how children fared in same-sex couple families. And so there'd been, at the time, some research on it, and I had done a fair amount of research about family structure and child well-being, but I hadn't specifically looked at same-sex couple families. And so I worked with some students here at Bowling Green, and we delved into the research and wrote a report, and the consensus from the literature really was that it didn't seem to have any negative effects, especially there were no negative associations, especially when you looked at nationally representative data sets. And so that was important when, as a nation, we were trying to make decisions about whether to legalize marriage for same-sex couples. And one of the arguments against that was that children are going to suffer and they're going to have negative outcomes. And the research did not indicate that at the time. And even to this day, there isn't research to support that argument. So it's that finding has held up pretty strongly. And so it was part of the basis of the Obergefell decision, but really I think a lot of the courts had decided that the well-being of, they sort of accepted the finding about the well-being of children faring as well, and that both sides sort of moved that off of that as an argument against marriage.
Was this was it kind of based out of here? Like the research was, you did like the meta-analysis for this whole thing?
Yeah, we did we wrote a report, and then we worked with the lawyers who actually prepared the legal brief that goes to the Supreme Court, and it's one of those things that I knew very little about. I'd never heard of an amicus brief before I started this, and so it was sort of exciting to be part of it. And the lawyers crafted a brief that summarized the argument and stated that children do not fare worse when they're raised in same-sex parent families.
So you kind of translated. So you looked at the data, and then you told what it meant to the lawyers, and then the lawyers translated it into legal.
Right.
speak.
So it sort of like gets down, but to prepare a brief for Supreme Court is it even has to be printed in special font and prepared. It's very. There's many steps and stages to that, and so you couldn't expect someone with no legal training to be able to do that. And so it was
Supreme Court likes it in Comic Sans font, I heard.
Yeah. And it's sort of exciting to have been part of that. But and so what was nice is when Jim Obergefell came to campus, because he went to Bowling Green for a short, that I got to meet him, and so that was really exciting. His case was not so much didn't have anything to do really with children. His was more about the rights of the right to marry and the right. His case was more about being recognized on a
kind of a moral,
death certificate. Yeah, his was about more at the end of life, thinking about the value and the importance of marriage. So what these cases really brought forward was it helped us understand the value of marriage. I think we might have taken for granted what you get out of marriage legally, and it sort of highlighted there's a lot of benefits to being married, but most of those benefits accrue to when you're later in life. So there's some things about marriage in terms of being able to adopt children, and that's where I think the case about children was strongest. And not even after the case, it's still not legal in all states for same-sex couples to adopt children.
Okay.
They
I didn't know that.
And so there's still challenges to that. And there's still some pockets in the United States where they are not allowing same-sex couples to marry. There's still, and I think about as of this spring, there were still 6 states that had different counties where they were clerks were not allowing. So even though the Supreme Court rules, then it still takes a while to filter down. But certainly our attitudes about marriage of same-sex couples, I think, have shifted where there's there's still quite high acceptance.
Socially among.
Yeah, when you ask people, is it okay? How do you feel about that for couples of the same gender to legally marry? And I think it sort of got caught in the crosshairs between you want to value marriage and allow everyone to enter this very valuable and important institution. And so people were sort of, I think, sort of maybe caught off guard. Like, how do I put those two arguments together where marriage is so important that everybody should have the benefit of it, and that's why it was called marriage equality. And the other issue were, concerns about whether marriage was meant for people of the same gender or not, and so, but I think most people felt in the end that it was something that as a nation that we wanted to support. So I think it was a huge change in our culture about sexual minorities and gave voice to some of the issues, and it was one that was something that everybody could understand and get their head around. And I think there's been struggles with some other rights that are associated that sexual minorities have been fighting for, haven't been as successful. So, but there's still, I think some of them, it's harder to capture the imagination. It was sort of a perfect argument about marriage, I think, as opposed to some of the other arguments. But I think anything about equality does sort of strike a nerve, and you're always going to have a pretty large share of folks who are going to be supportive of that.
Yeah, and I guess we shouldn't be surprised that the social climate is ahead of the policy, because that's always how it kind of works.
Right, and so they kind of go hand in hand. As each state was allowing, as increasing numbers of states were allowing same-gender couples to marry, you also saw at the same time sort of a increase in acceptance in attitude polls about marriage to same-sex couples. So they sort of kind of went hand in hand, but it does take a while for the legal system to probably catch up with our views.
So going into when you say outcomes for children, what exactly are some of the rulers, I guess you could say, that you're measuring outcomes with? Because it can,
there's
some people construe it to be kind of like a subjective outcomes.
Sometimes there are reports by parents. Sometimes there were reports by teachers in some of the data sets. They were ranged from things like, they call them externalizing behaviors, like maybe lashing out or acting out or not being able to control their temper, having behavior problems, versus internalizing problems, which are more psychological sort of issues that relate to children. There were some data sets that were focusing on adolescents, so they had things like more delinquency, sexual activity, kind of indicators along those lines. And so, of course, you can imagine, depending what age of the child you're talking about, the outcomes that you select are going to vary. So some studies were focusing on young children, some were focusing on older children, so it varied.
And from what I've heard, reaction to novelty or lashing out, usually associated with high neuroticism, and that's not that's a pretty good determinant of whether or not you're going to be how much stress you're going to be under, and pretty good predictor of outcome from what I've seen. So it's not like you got angry because you spilt your milk or something more than this other child. It's pretty correlative to from what I know to actually having a better life, I guess you could say. Not to
some of these early childhood indicators are asked because they've been found to be associated with later indicators of adult adjustment and adult well-being, and moving on to pro-social adulthood where you're employed or in school, things like that. So I think these some of these early family life indicators can be very very important. But I would say we still need to do a lot more research on this, and that it's not, I don't think the final word is out there, and I said that at the time, and I would say that today, that we still don't know everything that we need to know to make strong assessments about child well-being, partly because how same-gender couples have children varies a lot. So some of them are children from prior relationships, prior heterosexual relationships, and so those children might be more, that family might be more like a step family. Some folks have children through artificial insemination or surrogacy, or adopt foster children, or just adopt young children or older children. And so the way the pathways through which those families are formed could have implications for child well-being and for our understanding. So
what you're saying is the situation is just a mess to control with.
It's really hard to figure out, and there's so many different ways that everyone forms families, but specifically same-gender families, for biological reasons, have even more complexity than different gender couples.
I guess this is really only one policy issue that I want to get into. So if like you found in your research like, oh yeah, it doesn't even have to be like same-sex couples. Like if you found in research to say like poor, this is pretty much true. Like poor families usually have the children usually have worse outcomes just because of the situation they're in. What do you think about policy that just kind of wants to? Because that's essentially what that was the argument behind the gay rights is that they would have worse outcomes. How do you feel about just policy being in place to prevent people from adopting just because they might have a worse outcome?
Yeah, I think it's sort of a hard question. I mean, I think there isn't evidence that I think same gender couples should need to go through the same level of scrutiny as different gender couples in terms of adopting children and fostering children, and I think all people should be applauded for going through the process of all that involves and wanting to, I think most people really want to help raise children who for whatever reason are not able to be raised by their biological parents. So I think I would hope that the same level of scrutiny would occur across the board, and that children could be placed in loving families that are interested in looking out for their well-being. And so I don't see and so to prevent or discriminate against couples who are same gender seems misaligned with the goals of trying to help place children in healthy homes. And so I would hope that evidence was used to provide family equality, so that all children and all parents could, if someone's willing to put forward their love and effort to raise a child, then I think we should embrace that effort, because that's a wonderful thing. So but there's still there's policies that still make it hard for same gender couples to have families and to raise families, and there's issues that can affect families in terms of employment discrimination. So there's not as many protections as we might like for supporting same gender couples in the workplace, and that sometimes that could be a basis of termination, and there aren't any protections on the books for those folks, and that can translate to children then not having parents who can have full-time employment. So those are ways that there's all kinds of policies that trickle out there, and any kind of discrimination is going to make it could make it harder for those families.
So I'm unfamiliar with like the scrutiny that's applied to like income with adoption. What kind of scrutiny is there for like not allowing people to adopt? If they're is there a bar there that you have to make this much money to adopt? Or
I think it's pretty complicated. It's not just resources. They have to do a home visit, and they have to make sure that you're stable and that you have a place for they visit, you have a safe home. I think they look into things like substance use, so it's a not
holistic
just
view into
it's psychological well-being and letters of recommendation. I think it's a big process to go through. Yeah. And so it's not just that, but I'm just saying that we want to try to avoid any kind of discrimination based on any basis in terms of gender, race, ethnicity, veteran status, disability status, sexual orientation. I think all of these things are amongst millennials and young adults today are sort of taken for granted, but yet there's still policies that probably don't align well with some of the views. So when I teach, the students are like, oh, they're supportive of equality for everybody, but yet our policies don't always line up. And so I think that's some of the challenges, and as maybe as we move forward, some of those policies will change as new generations of folks come up and challenge them and say it's just It's not how we want to be as a society.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So with like step parents, there's some pretty tenuous research on like step parents like harming their childs at a higher rate.
Yeah.
And some people, it seems like it's pretty valid that there's like a detection bias that step parents who abuse their children are more likely to be found out than biological parents.
Right.
So it's not really settled by any means by like if that's a fact or not. But do you think there's anything lost in like biologically not being related to your child?
There's research that definitely shows that parents might make different investments in children, based on and it's not true for everybody, but it's just sort of on average. You might invest less in a child that's not your biological offspring. You might not invest as many of your psychological, social, financial resources into that child. You might feel less obligated because there is another biological parent who could invest in that child, and so there's some research to that effect. But the issue is, again, families are so complicated, so it might depend a lot on the level of support that the child is receiving from their other biological parents. So that can definitely play a role, and the research seems to support that the kids are better off. The more people involved in their lives, the better off they're going to be. But of course, it depends on who these folks are. And so people who care about the child and are willing to invest psychological and social capital into that child are going to do better. So, for example, if you have a step parent who, or even a biological parent who is not, who is abusing drugs and has a serious drug problem, they're not going to be able to effectively parent anybody, And so I think we want to think about more than just what's the biological relationship, but what capacities do different parents have to care for their children. And given we know that about half of children are going to spend some time outside of a two biological married parent family, well over half are going to. So, we want to think about the best ways we can help those families provide healthy home environments for children. And so the research does show that the two biological married family, those children do fare better. But there's not much you can do when we're in a society where 40% of children are born outside of marriage. Their parents aren't married, and if they're not married, by the child's third birthday, they're just not going to get married. And so that doesn't mean that we just dismiss the other half of kids and say, hey, you don't count, and we're not gonna
find a biological
parent. You can't. It's almost like you can't put the genie back. You can't put the genie back in the bottle. Like if they're not married right away, and you don't maybe want them to be married, there's something, kids are not going to be well off with two parents who don't get along or don't want to be together, and so that's always the problem. A lot of research contrasts the step family, but there's a lot of different kinds of step families. There's step families where they have where somebody gets remarried and they have new children together, and there's half and step siblings in the household. It depends when the family was formed, if it was when they were really young, when the kid was young, or when the kid is older. It really depends on how the parents manage this complex family. We have people who are cohabiting step parents, so they're not married, but they're living with the mother and their child. And so what does that mean? And often stepfathers have children from prior relationships, and so how do all of those children get along? What are their relationships? And so that's the hard thing, is that we don't have rules that help people navigate some of these relationships. So you sort of make it up as you go along, and you can't turn to sort of, here's the standard way you're supposed to act, right? This is how I'm supposed to treat my mom's boyfriend's kid. I don't know how I'm supposed to, if they're a lot younger or older. And so there's just a lot of different ways that we we come up with these broad categories, but it's just hard to know what they mean for children and for their parents. So in this climate, in this landscape today, I think assuming that parents are going to marry again is just low.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and so if it's how do we help those families?
Okay.
Yeah.
That's good. With like same-sex partners,
Mm-hmm.
I read. I can't remember what I was reading of. I think I was reading the brief actually online.
Mm-hmm.
You're talking. I was talking about how they'll. You don't necessarily have to subscribe to like with same-sex partners. They don't have to subscribe to like the roles down the middle to have like the same equal outcome for the children. Like they don't have to assume.
Yeah, there's some notion that you need to assume sort of a more masculine, a more feminine parenting role, and that children need both. And so how can you ensure that? And I think that's probably an artifact of our traditional beliefs about
It's been
gender.
this way, so it's like
right.
This is probably a thing.
And so we all know we all have families where it's not always the male part. Sometimes we assume the woman is a more nurturing parent, but that's not always true. And we see all kinds of ways that people can offer what we consider, we think of nurturing as more feminine, but actually we are seeing new roles of fathers in families where they're more nurturing than they ever were before, and they're more involved with caregiving than they ever were before. And so we've really shifted out of sort of where the male is in charge of making money outside the home and the woman is in charge of taking care of the home. And so I think, but that sort of artifact shadows how people think about same-sex couple families.
Yeah, and it's interesting that people see it as like a set in stone kind of thing, because the book I'm reading right now, it's by Robert Sapolsky. He's a neuroscientist.
Mm-hmm.
It's called Behave. It talks about how the invention of the plow is positively correlated with female inequality. So like as soon as people figured, like as soon as like the men started working the field, it was correlated with basically the women staying in the household. Cultures that had like that didn't switch to that, they just used like a hose.
Yeah.
They were a lot less. They were a lot more gender
Oh,
equal.
uh-huh.
I don't think people.
Interesting.
I don't think people really value how like tenuous it is to like the situation, and it doesn't have to be one set thing.
Right. And even today, if you look at women, it used to be if women had a high level of education, they were less likely to marry than women who have low levels of education. But now there's an education gradient that's reversed, where women with high levels of education are more likely to marry because they're more desirable, because they can also go out and make money, and that if you want to live a middle-class lifestyle, you really need to have two earners. And so sort of those roles have really changed, and we've seen really changing patterns in educational homogamy in families, and how couples are both contributing economically to the family, and they're both contributing to raising the children. The divide still seems to exist among housework. It still seems that women do more housework than men. Can't quite tackle that one quite yet, but that's still, there's still room to change.
Yeah. So the birth rate has been going down a bit in America, right?
Mm-hmm.
How do we kind of curtail the fact that people are just less likely to have children, and again, like with females, like they kind of have kind of caught between having to work a job and like manage a family.
Mm-hmm.
What do you have any ideas about how to better maternity leave for like the father too?
So some of the people are concerned about the sort of slight decline in birth rates in the United States, and I don't know how long term of a decline this will be. But I think it represents some of the challenges for folks to combine family life and work life. And as a society, we don't make it very easy for people to do that. So other places, and so the wonderful example that everybody turns to always is, someplace like Sweden or where they have child long-term maternity leave and paternity leave policies to sort of encourage parents to parent their young children and to be able to take time away from work to do that, and then once they go back to work to make it easier to have state-supported childcare. And in the United States, we don't have that kind of system, so it's hard for people to navigate work and family life, and it creates a lot of stress and tension. And I think if we made it easier for people to have families and raise families, then people probably would be interested in having children. Some of it is they're delaying having their children. Some of it is they aren't meeting, they would like to have more, it's not only just whether you have a child, but the number of children. So some people are just maybe having one child instead of two, or just having two instead of their desired 3 children because they can't afford to. It costs a lot of money, more so than ever before, and especially if you want your child to go to college, the dollars it takes to raise a child from infancy through college have skyrocketed.
Yeah.
And so in terms of providing just housing, child care while you're at work, health care, educational costs, and then sort of what's expected of parents and how they have to invest in their children has changed. So we're in a society where you have to work, you're supposed to work really hard and be a very involved, good parent, and that very intensive parenting at the middle class. So that involves, getting your children involved in all these activities. And so how do you facilitate that
and
as
also,
working parent? Yeah. And so
also going to work for $15 an hour while you put them in a daycare that's $16 an hour.
Yeah. How do you navigate that, and how do you navigate people who have work different shifts? And so that's one way that families try to save is that one who works at night, one will work during the day, but then somehow you still have to figure out ways to care for your children. Some people work out of their home more than ever before, and some of that's facilitated through telecommuting, so that can save people from having to rush to pick up their kid from daycare, and save some of those costs.
I think it would be interesting to see if I can't remember what the percentage of predicted jobs that are going to be worked out of home in the next 20 years, but it's higher than right now, obviously.
Yeah.
And that with maternity leave, I'd be very interested to see if that would kind of ameliorate the kind of difference in childcare, because in America, I think the stigma is that, and I would guess that the fact of the matter is the mother takes a disproportionately higher care of the child than the father.
Yeah. And so it has a greater hit on her earnings having a child than it does on a male's earnings. And so, there is definitely, and then having more telecommuting could allow families ways to combine their work-family demands in a more efficient way.
Flexible way.
Yeah. So I think people are trying to think of flexible ways to combine that, but definitely providing reasonable leave when people have children, and then allowing them flexible schedules when they have demands for caretaking. And people also are thinking of expanding that to caretaking for older folks. So also, if people have to care for their parents or for other spouses as they age, and people are staying in the labor force longer than before, then those become important demands as well. So there's some people thinking about that, the other end.
Yeah. What do you see do you see the family just getting more and more kind of flexible and interchangeable as a definition as we go on, or as far as I guess the question is basically, where do you see the family in 20 years?
Yeah, that's a good question. some people think that the family is just going to become more and more complex, that it almost you can't even figure out what it is. You can't even wrap your hands around it and define it. And I'm not as convinced of that. I think, we're not going to shift to a society where people have communal living and where, you don't raise your own child. I don't think we're going to go that way. But I sort of think we're maybe peaking in sort of the complexity of family life, and so we will. I'm hopeful that there's more equality in families, and that children's futures aren't determined so much by their family circumstances, and that we could offer. As a society, more so that we could children could start life with a more equal playing field, and that what family you were born into wouldn't determine where you go in life. And so in the United States, there's not a lot of social mobility. It's hard to move up the social ladder, especially when it comes to social class. And so if there were more opportunities, I think that would be, and if we move in that, and so it sort of depends. If we move in that direction, then I think families are going to look a little different. If we remain as we are, we're going to probably have a bifurcation in family life where we're going to have sort of this college-educated elite who are going to have one kind of family, and everybody else is going to have a different kind. And that's sort of, they call that diverging destinies, and that's sort of what exists today, and that might continue where we have growing inequality across
it certainly is a matter
childhood.
Of just ideas that's certainly happening in terms of like the quote unquote educated elite, and then the kind of middle or working class. There's definitely the divergence of ideas there. There's sort of when any family pattern you look at, you can see the college educated are here, and then everybody else, it doesn't matter if you have some college or just if you have a high school degree, like everybody sort of looks real similar. And so we only have about 30% of the population has a college degree, so we don't, the bulk of society would not be in what we're considering more positive family. They wouldn't have children have the opportunity to experience maybe more positive family environments. And so we just have to so that's a big question about generating greater equality. And I think there are ways the government could help, but strictly how is
how like and what avenue we go, it's going to depend. We'll see. And so we can look to other countries and see what they're doing and have some better sense of where there's a more narrow, there's less child inequality in some other countries, and so that provides us some clues what would happen if we would shift in that direction. But some of those would require a lot of resources and a lot of change and different political viewpoints and priorities for that to occur.
Okay. Last question. I might edit this part out because I'm not exactly sure how I'm representing this, but
okay.
So in the book I'm reading, it talks about, I believe it's a vasopressin receptor. This vasopressin gene that you get will determine what vasopressin receptors you have, and those are related to the kinds of relationships you'll have. So, and I believe the examples like vole rats. There's two different kinds of voles, which are like moles that live in the ground. There's some in one part of the world that are pretty much monogamous, that have one type of vasopressin receptor, and then the other side of the planet, I don't know where exactly, they have a different receptor and they're polygamous. And there's it's not the exact same representation in humans, but you see kind of a similar dichotomy in humans with you see a certain vasopressin gene, you can determine how long they'll on average stay in like relationships. So I was wondering what you thought about that in terms of like those people are generally not going to want to have a married life, right? So
right. So I think I can't speak to speak to this idea exactly, but I think there can be a lot of individual variation in how much people desire having a settled life, or a settled married life, or a conventional married life, maybe.
What they would consider like a
So there could be a lot of individual variation, and some of that could be physiological in some sense. Maybe you're somebody who, for whatever reason, doesn't care about consequences, or doesn't have empathy, care about consequences to hurting other people, and so that you would probably not be the best person to be in a relationship because you can't. A lot of what it takes to be in a relationship is you have to have empathy and say, hey, if you really want me to do this, then I'm going to do it because it's going to make you happy, it'll make me happy. But if you don't have those psychological resources, if it's based on physiological basis, then that could be problematic to maintaining and sustaining a relationship. So that certainly could exist, but I think some of the social factors could override that. So you learn, even if people are born maybe with some of those, what I might consider traits, some of them could be learned and overcome. And so even though maybe that's, and so we have a range, you might have a range. And so some people could be raised in environments where they are modeled on this behavior of sharing and empathy and learn the value of a stable relationship, and they might be able to overcome that predisposition that they have. And so I just don't, I think it's hard to think that, some of these biological factors are so deterministic.
Yeah, because they're not. In the book it talks about how if you're speaking like causally about what's causing something, if you're trying to figure out the area of a rectangle, asking what's more deterministic, like genes or environment. So it's a lot like asking of that or rectangle, what's more determinant of the volume of the area, like the length or the width. So you can't really.
So it's hard to know, and we don't have much control over anybody's physiological constraints, right? Being aware of them could help us learn, okay. And even people's personalities. And so we know, okay, you're the kind of person who thinks this way, so you might be, but I think you can, if you're self-aware, you could probably learn, or if your parents were aware, they could realize, like, okay, this is your personality, but it doesn't mean your destiny is to never be able to be in a happy relationship because you seem like you're a selfish kid, right? You know, it could be all kinds of things. So I think, and I think that's what's exciting about probably about sociology, is that's what we're interested in, is how do, we don't dismiss the importance of biology, but we're saying maybe some of the more proximal factors and the more malleable factors are your social climate and your social environment. And so that's why we think understanding family life for children is really important, because that's the building blocks.
It's easier to change the situation rather than like a trait.
Right. Yeah, I can't change whether you get angry. If you get angry for, some people get angry, you just like light a match and they get mad.
Yeah.
And some of that is learned, some of that is probably just how you are. And so I can't do much about that, but I can help if I know you're kind of an angry person, then I know that maybe the kind of program that would work well for you to avoid being involved in intimate partner violence would be things that would teach you about how to navigate relationships given that, and to be aware, like, okay, I get angry easily, so when I feel that way, I should probably do this instead of this, And maybe you would pick this kind of person, and maybe you shouldn't pick somebody else who also has the same trait.
Yeah, it'd probably not be good in that case specifically too.
So, but people. So I think that's what's exciting about what we do.